Okay. Okay, so for this episode, we're going to be talking about the ways in which attachment manifests in personality disorders, mainly kind of BPD and narcissistic personality disorder. So I figured I'll start it off by making a claim that has some truth, and that is oftentimes a narcissistic parent will produce a child that has kind of this borderline personality disorder and anxious attachment. And I think the reason for that is because when you are the child of someone who's narcissistic, what you quickly learn is that you have to make sure you meet these people's needs. And so your empathy kind of becomes overextended for someone else at the expense of yourself. And your fear of abandonment is often triggered because at any moment, this parent can emotionally withdraw. And as a consequence, your sense of relationships feels very conditional. And then as an adult, that really affects your attachment relationships with other people because you start to assume all relationships are conditional. And at the end of the day, all of this kind of serves to dysregulate you and really impact your ability to cope in the world.
What would you say is the most common cognitive distortion of someone with borderline personality disorder?
I'm feeling it, therefore it must be true.
Wow.
And one of the main tenets of if you're ever in a DBT program, you would learn that it's a statement that we directly challenge, and we ask you in group therapy, what is a more holistic way to view this cognitive distortion? And often what people will say is, okay, so my feelings do not make something true, but my feelings are valid. And I feel like because someone with BPD often grows up in an invalidating environment, this idea that someone's telling them that their feelings aren't true, they're misunderstanding that to mean their feelings aren't valid. No, your feelings are valid, but the appraisal you have of this moment and this situation may not be accurate, and therefore the data that's informing the way you feel is misunderstood.
Yeah, and now you're taking that and making quick decisions that don't necessarily benefit you or people around you sometimes.
Exactly. And it's funny, I know like kind of BPD is more my thing, but what's the part of why we vibe so well with the professional stuff. I mean, we're not really friends outside of this, but
yeah. I would bump your car
we
by
clock
mistake.
in and we clock out.
Yeah, if I bump your car, it's fine with me.
But the reason why I know I've learned so much about attachment has been on my own, because when you're being trained in DBT, there's like a brief moment where they talk about attachment very quickly. But they'll talk about attachment because basically when we psychoeducate a client who is diagnosed with BPD, we're like, look, the reason you are this way is partly a combination of, well, you're probably just a sensitive creature. It's a good thing that your instruments are highly refined, but coupled with that is probably growing up in an unstable environment. And so attachment is such a major factor in the development of BPD. Not everyone with anxious attachment has BPD, but a lot of people with anxious attachment do, because they were told, hey, if you feel me emotionally withdrawing from you, it's because you're doing something wrong. And, if you really want to use the dark arts against someone with BPD, you can convince them that they did anything, even if they didn't do it. They're so ready to accept blame and guilt, and so kind of terrified of the way someone might misconstrue their actions that they're preoccupied with it, and that kind of leads to anxious attachment.
Yeah, I think so. Like if that's your presentation and you have anxious attachment, you have the gift of sensitivity. But if you take that gift and you're surrounded by an environment of people that are hurting you emotionally, that gift really quickly turns into a curse. Now you're not just absorbing a regular amount of emotional pain, but more so than the people around you. So, of course, with anxious attachment, you're extremely empathic. You can read people well and all that. but that gift quickly gets overridden by the amount of pain that you're anticipating from childhood if you've been extremely invalidated your whole life. So if you take the combination of high levels of empathy and high levels of, emotional awareness, then you take this feeling and you feel like, I need to destroy this in myself. And so I feel like sometimes you can align with the perpetrator, and then you start to feel like, I can't trust in relationships. I'm afraid of what will happen to me. And so now the only way to cope is to plan ahead, to be urgent when it comes to communication, to avoid abandonment and to not put people through the same thing. And then people will judge you harshly in your environment because they don't understand, why are you so sensitive? And the real reason you're sensitive is because it's a gift, and also because you've been invalidated in that gift. So it's just it's a really, really rough cycle for people with BPD, because it's like that you both get misunderstood, and you're dealing with the pain of what happened to you, and your environment saying, look at you're making relationships harder. And I think a lot of people with BPD get a bad rep because they're like always trying to push boundaries. Well, I think the reason that they're trying to push boundaries is because they didn't have the luxury of having boundaries as kids. And they're trying to see if you can reach them where they're at, because you sit behind your wall of boundaries and privilege as a therapist sometimes. And you don't realize that the only reason you can't relate to this client with BPD is because you've been so privileged to be able to avoid the negative emotions that they've had to face throughout their whole life. So now they're in your shadow side.
Mm-hmm. And I would even go one step further and say, people with BPD push other people's boundaries because they grew up learning that in order for me to demonstrate to my parent that I care about them, I have to let them push my boundaries. It becomes this performative symbol of, I care about you because I'm letting you walk over my boundaries, because someone in their childhood convinced them that's the only way I know you care. And so that's why the reason DBT was formed partly was because there needed to be a more rigid structure to allow for treatment of BPD outside of hospitals. The issue is, because people with BPD grow up in such an enmeshed environment where boundaries are seen as abandonment, when they meet a therapist who's trying to help them, they're going to constantly try pushing the therapist's boundaries to test to see if the therapist cares about them. And so if you're not incredibly trained on how to navigate that, what's likely to happen is a bad therapist is not going to handle that well. A bad therapist might react with anger themselves and not be able to handle this boundary pushing, rather than seeing it simply for what it is, which is therapy interfering behavior. And so the solution for a therapist in that scenario is, this person has never seen what caring for someone while maintaining boundaries looks like. If the main core issue with them is this idea that you can't care about me unless you let me push your boundaries, then I need to show them how I can care about them while maintaining boundaries. Mm-hmm. And that's it usually comes to a head at some point where there's like, it's conditioning, right? And so all conditioning has an extinction burst. So if you condition a BPD client out of pushing your boundaries by still showing up for them and still showing that you care in other ways, there's going to be this one moment where they go, okay, I think they care about me, but I need one more test. The final test.
There's always a
like
final
that
test.
scene in Dune where he puts his hand in the box and it's really you've never seen it, but it's really
I can pretend though. No, that's a huge point, because it's like striking the balance between healthy boundaries with someone who is trying to push your boundaries in therapy. It doesn't look like happily setting up a wall and watching this person get dysregulated because you set up a boundary with them. It looks like unconditional positive regard of, I am setting this boundary with you and I want you to thrive. And I really feel empathy that you don't feel good as we have this boundary set up. And yet we're going to try to find strategic ways to walk this balance so that you still feel cared for in this therapeutic relationship. And I think that's the issue, especially if you're working with someone with anxious attachment. It's boundaries feel like abandonment. So working through that is constantly pushing the message and the countering message that boundaries don't always mean abandonment. Sometimes boundaries are gateways to connection in an appropriate way. It's a way that is is going to allow space for you and the other person. And if you can wait in the middle of that boundary and find that you can connect, you'll find that boundaries start to actually feel good. Boundaries will start to feel like connection. Now, you don't want to go too far on the other end of the avoidant attachment and feel like boundaries are the only thing that can, like, will always need to exist. But I think the securely attached person realizes that boundaries weren't always meant to be boundaries. They're sometimes the necessary thing you need to make sure that connections are appropriate and they actually can lead to. And once you build that association, then you start to actually appreciate them over time.
And I say that to clients all the time. Like, you want evidence of how boundaries and closeness can still exist? Look at this relationship. I am your therapist. There's tons of boundaries in place. And at the same time, there is a deep connection occurring and lots of vulnerability and growth. And so even in the most boundaried place you can be, there is room for deep connection. And I feel, by the way, what you just said was just so perfect. Like, just turn that into a TikTok. That's just a little bow.
Thank you.
Just brackets. But it's funny how we started talking about BPD and it inevitably led to a conversation about boundaries, because boundaries are one of the boundaries are one of the number one ways you can identify someone with BPD. If someone with ADHD, kind of hyperactivity, is bouncing off the walls, well, someone with BPD is pushing your boundaries in some way. And that's fine. But it also kind of goes back to the topic of attachment, because when you are an infant, what you're really doing, besides developing a sense of regulation in the attachment context, what you're doing is developing an idea of where the edge of you ends and the edge of someone else begins. Because when you're a baby and an infant, there is no me and there is no you. There's just me. Everything is me. And as you get older, in your early infancy, this idea of, okay, actually, that's not me. I'm here and my parents are there. There's actually quite a line. But when you have a parent that is narcissistic or in some ways emotionally immature, what happens is they never allow you to completely establish this clear line of you. This idea that there is a full version of you that is separate from them never takes shape. And so your identity is somewhat molded into theirs, and the ways in which it's molded into theirs cause you a lot of trouble as an adult.
Yeah, totally. Like, there's this, Carl Jung talks about this, but he calls it individuation. And it's sort of like when you're an infant, there's no individuation happening just yet. You feel like you identify with the world around you. And there's this really, really good, if you think philosophically, holy goodness that comes from being an infant and the world moving everything around to become a part of your world. You don't have to do anything. But the necessary thing that needs to happen is like with anxious attachment, individuation is not fully developed, right? You feel like everybody is a part of your identity. And when people are gone, you don't really have an identity outside of that. So the people pleaser, according to Carl Jung, has not fully individuated yet. So they try to skip the process in relationships. If someone seems like a person of interest, the person with anxious attachment will try to fully adopt everything to meet that person's world, and they hope that the other person does the same for them. But healing looks like, how do I first develop an identity on my own? And then as we start to build the appropriate sort of aspects of our relationship, respect those boundaries, and then slowly become a unit in a way, a unit that both respects boundaries, but also can experience this oneness over time and the appropriate timing. That's why it can feel so urgent with anxious attachment to quickly become one with another person, because you feel like it's urgent. It needs to happen. That's exactly what I've been looking for since childhood, and I never got over it.
Wow, there's like a handful of new thoughts I've never had that you just said. Really cool. Really fun.
Nice.
One of the ones that I thought was really interesting was this idea that a people pleaser basically is someone who has never completely individuated. Like this idea, like they're not completely themselves, and therefore, how could their needs be valued above someone else? Someone else is them. In the most profound way, you are me, therefore I must please you before I identify my own stuff.
And that makes me think of BPD, right? Because with BPD, you're constantly fighting the boundaries. You're constantly pushing to get back to that. So it's so connected to, I hadn't thought about it until we did this episode, but the BPD and anxious attachment, how they can go hand in hand in that way.
They're so connected, and I feel like the reason people with BPD tend to have anxious attachment over something like fearful attachment is because someone with anxious attachment is taking a lot more responsibility for why things are going wrong. They're blaming themselves inappropriately for why things are not going right in their external world, why people keep leaving them, why they keep having conflict. Someone with fearful attachment, on the other hand, is not necessarily blaming themselves as much. They kind of don't mind themselves. They just can't figure out a way to put themselves in the larger social context, so they remove themselves, you know?
Yeah, that makes perfect sense, because that's probably why they have such an issue with dating and always run into people that are more avoidant, narcissistic, and things like that. Not just because they have to make up for the lack of emotional support and the emotional empathy vampires, I think the word you said before, but it's also that with anxious attachment, you don't really exist in relationships at all. You are more so vigilant to see, what does this person want? How do I give them that? And how do I make a way to get past their boundaries that hold me at arm's length? So who's going to be comfortable with that? Well, it's going to be the person that looks more so towards internal regulation for support, and someone who doesn't need external sources of information. With anxious attachment, you look externally towards other people's internal state to determine what's true about reality. So if you're dating someone and you feel that they're regulated, even though they don't even know who you are, then that's going to be okay for you. And the only people that are okay with being in a relationship with you without knowing anything about you or who you are going to be avoidant people who are satisfied in relationships because they know themselves. But if you're with another anxiously attached person, as someone anxiously attached, you're not going to feel any chemistry or connection, because you're both playing this game where you're trying to identify what's happening in the other person, and you both come up with nothing. So you're like, this person's changing their whole life around to meet my needs. Now the anxiously attached person starts to look avoidant because they feel like there's nothing here. You know, this is boring.
I picture like two people baking like a big lasagna for the other person, and they're both hungry, but they're both unaware of being hungry, and they really just need the other person to eat their lasagna. And neither party is eating it because they're each trying to get the other person to eat it.
Exactly.
There's your insane analogy of the day.
There we go. I love it. The lasagna.
But it's just interesting. I feel like, anxious. I feel like the difference between someone who has kind of just like mild anxious attachment versus someone who's got anxious attachment with a flavor of BPD is someone with BPD is going to have much more identity stuff going on. Like there's identity stuff in both of those things, but with someone with BPD, there is almost a solidified sense of I'm inadequate. It's very palpable, it's very clear, it's very easy to trigger in them. And the ways in which they navigate their anxious attachment feels like life or death, because at every wrong turn is this deep sense of shame and inadequacy that they are constantly running away from.
Mm-hmm. And for you, how would you? I have borderline personality disorder. I'm not saying I have it. I'm just being hypothetical. Not that it would be awful in the world if I did have it. Anyways, I'm not judging anybody. I just really cornered myself there.
Yeah.
Anyways.
That's fun to watch.
It's like a train wreck. No, I'm just kidding. If someone has borderline personality disorder, what are you telling them? How are you working with them to navigate that? What kind of tips, stuff you would do as a therapist?
To navigate shame. Is that what you're asking?
Or yeah. Whatever it is that the person with borderline personality is dealing with the most, and shame definitely. Yeah. How do you heal? How do you make it so that you have healthy relationships?
Well, I think it's such a boring answer, but I think it's my DBT training. At the root of most interpersonal conflict with BPD, it actually is simply just becoming dysregulated. Like you're prone to becoming emotionally distressed and dysregulated, and once you do, you start leaning on impulsive behaviors that are destructive. And so as long as you can manage your emotional distress, there's a higher likelihood your relationships aren't going to suffer. And so that's why a lot of, I'm sounding like I'm pitching DBT, but I'm not. But that's why a lot of DBT is about learning practical skills to regulate your distress and understanding that based on how overwhelmed you are, it's going to determine which skills you use. You're not going to meditate on your sadness or meditate on your fear as a rhino is charging you. You're going to get the fuck out of the way. A tornado is coming towards your house. Don't explore your emotions. Distract yourself. So kind of understanding which tool to use in your tool belt is a really important like meta skill that people don't really acknowledge the importance of when talking about BPD.
Yeah. Wow. Dysregulation, because I think that there's like the route you can take with borderline personality disorder where you feel so much that you can either not want to give people the power to dysregulate you by trying to damper it down and not look at it and just feel it, let it happen. And then there's also the route of feeling it and then wanting people to see your pain and to push those boundaries so you can see this is real, to show people how much you're hurting. And I think that's also why a lot of times people with borderline personality disorder can engage in self-harm behaviors too, right? Because they are experiencing so much internal pain that in a sense is leaking out to the outside. And they're like, I need people to understand, because validation comes from understanding, but also even just the sensation of feeling, can be. So lots of different reasons there, right? But
this is a line that I always love to say as matter-of-factly as possible to throw people off when I meet them, when I used to do more BPD work, which is like, so self-harm, do you self-harm? And most of the time the person will say yes, or they have in the past. And it's like, well, that's a good way to regulate yourself. The problem is you only have like a couple of arms and legs. And so,
ouch, yeah.
So it's not that, people are not self-harming because they hate themselves. They're self-harming because it is truly a way to help regulate their distress. And the reality is it's very conditioning to do a thing that is going to provide you relief. Obviously, it's definitely not, that juice is not worth the squeeze, but it's only not worth the squeeze when you find an alternative that has some efficacy too. And until you have that, you're going to lean on the thing that works.
Wow. Yeah. I think like philosophically too, this is so connected to my views as a Christian, because, we believe that the ultimate euphoria in heaven is being one. And since, sin has entered the picture, there's this wall, this barrier that's both emotional and physical that keeps us from becoming one. And I think people with BPD experience such disconnect in childhood. They more anxiously long for the reality of being one, and they want to push the boundaries. How can I push the boundaries that we've been given with these human limitations when it comes to connection with other people? And also, I wonder if there's even a connection with the self. Like, I'm disconnected from myself and there's so much pain, and I regulate even by pushing the boundaries of my own skin to get closer. It just seems like with borderline personality disorder, and I'm kind of thinking out loud here at this point.
I liked what you're saying. I have things to say.
Okay, it's sort of like this longing for more that
they never
bigger.
got. I don't think they ever got it. Like if you want to talk like religious, my spiritual stuff that I like to read, it's like basically they describe the spiritual journey in the like kind of Eastern non-dual perspective as like you start off as everything when you're zero. Like a baby feels like everything is them, but then you go from everything to me. And then when you start this spiritual process that I prefer, you go from everything to me to nothing. And the last kind of stage of that is to go from nothing into everything. And I feel like someone with BPD, they never got that truly satisfying first stage of being everything. Their everything was robbed of them by probably a selfish or needy caregiver. And so they almost have lacked this thing of security, of this sense of wholeness, because it was never afforded to them. They they were born into accommodating others. And so they're always trying to regain that sense of kind of what they'd never had.
That's just scientifically true, because that's how everybody develops their pain and pleasure instincts. Like if you hear about somebody that grew up without money, they can consume money so aggressively now as an adult because they learn that pain is not having this and pleasure comes from that. And so we all have these pain and pleasure instincts, whether it's familiarity, unfamiliarity, but borderline personality disorder is usually that you've gone from having, you've had nothing and you've seen people have it. And so you want to go from having nothing to past the border of what it is, because now that's your hyperfixation. That's your pleasure instinct.
And to take it one step further, the reason you have nothing is your fault. I think if you have BPD, there is a sense of my feelings of inadequacy are my doing. And a lot of the kind of higher level work with someone with BPD is recognizing that whatever sense of lack you feel is not something that you invoked. It's something that you experienced, but because you misappraised what was happening. I mean, I feel like people with BPD, one of their biggest issues, whether they're a child or an adult, is they see the same experience situation that you see, but they interpret it in such a biased way, in a direction towards their own kind of personal, how are they interacting with it? Like, how is this my fault? What could I have done differently? There's so much them in situations that don't require them, and it messes up their sense of reality. And that's why a lot of like mentalization work with BPD is questioning, like, what do you think they're thinking right now? Is that what you think they're thinking? Because I don't think they're thinking that. No, that's not reasonable. Oh, they don't love me because when they came home from work, they didn't give me a hug. Okay, so that's your perception of their internal state. But that is not actually their internal state. You're just making a jump in logic because you feel dysregulated.
Yes, because I mean, if you really think about it, if the other person had the same neural pathway connections that the person with BPD has, they probably would have not been happy with them if they didn't give them a hug, or if they got home late. It's probably true that but because that person has a different genetic wiring, it could be that, well, maybe this person is not going above and beyond and through the fire or whatever for you, because they just have a different makeup. And for you, if you love someone, you know that what love looks like for you is that going above and beyond, pushing the limits for someone to show them, like, I love you this much. And so the moment someone else doesn't meet that same energy, you're assuming, well, it could only be the reason that I wouldn't go past these limits to meet this person. And I think that's another gift, though, that people with BPD give the world, which is no fluff. I think that's why they work so well with therapists who are more like straight to the point. Like, and they're like, because literally there's a lot of rules we abide by as a society, as therapists, that we don't need, but we just like these because they're sort of the life raft of sort of like safety and norms that we like to hold on to so that we don't have to throw ourselves out there vulnerably. But I think people with BPD never had a life raft to start with, and they are like, can we just get over the rules and just like talk human to human? Because they long for connection, and they also hate probably that people can stand on those surfaces and say, this is a symptom. You trying to make me get out of my comfort zone is a symptom, when in reality sometimes it is, but also sometimes we can be slaves to social norms as people that are neurotypical, X, Y, and Z, and they're trying to pull you into a place that's actually more healthy. But because they're the client, they don't get much say,
Yeah, it's so funny you say that, because I have a friend who used to say, and who may identify with this, who used to say, I can't and I won't. like I don't want to deal with the bullshit. Let's just cut through. I mean, I do think, though, that because it's a reactive disposition, like, that's not your natural state. That's just the state you've become in order to navigate your early world, and now you just can't shake it. This radically authentic, sometimes probably abrasive. I think people who have BPD can sometimes come across as abrasive, and I think it's because they don't know when to stop hitting that authenticity button. I mean, on the one hand, I think people with BPD do get a bad rap, and I find them quite often endearing and kind and sweet people. But because they don't know when to stop hitting that authenticity button, it often leads to conflict with relationships because sometimes things can be true, but it doesn't necessarily mean you should be saying them in this moment. We could be at a funeral and you can try and comfort someone by saying like, well, we're all going to die. It's like, yeah, thank you. But that's not relevant for this moment.
Right.
And you leaning on this, well, I'm just a truth teller. It's like, no, you're a truth teller, but it's to the extent where you're no longer emotionally accommodating the people around you.
Yes. Yeah. Like, cause with BPD, one of the issues is that you can sort of use cognitive behavioral therapy in a way that really hurts you and people around you. Cause now you're magnifying something that wasn't paid attention to since childhood. So when you're talking to someone and you feel this negative emotion, I think healing when it comes to borderline personality disorder is making a regular practice of minimizing, not invalidating, but minimizing this very magnified internal experience. Because for you, the currency and bridge of connection in relationships looks like, how can I get as close to the heartbeat of my feeling and as close to the heartbeat of this person understanding my feeling? And so if you repeatedly flex sort of like this internal experience, people can pick up on it. And it's not flexing all the time, right? You are experiencing big things as a result of invalidation of some of the symptoms you've been dug into of your wounds. But hopefully over time, you can get to a point where you start to challenge the intensity of the emotions by riding the wave, and coming up with new core beliefs, challenging the thoughts, even though it can feel like you're invalidating yourself by getting healthy. Because once you get healthy, people are not going to see all of the pain that you've been through.
Mm-hmm.
And yet people that are truly for you at some point will start to care and will start to understand that, wow, you've been through a lot, and it's just coming to terms with that.
There's another mantra in DBT called validate the valid. And it kind of just sounds like nonsense, but there is always my spin on that is I truly believe there's always something to validate. And this is true if you have BPD and you have a difficult time validating your emotional experience. It's like, you want to know why you can validate every single emotional experience you're having? It's because you're having it. Like, it's actually happening. There's a difference between ruminating about some future event that might be scary or anxiety inducing. That's not happening. But if you're feeling anger, if you're feeling sadness, if you're feeling shame or embarrassment, that's happening. And so to acknowledge its existence and to allow it to exist is that form of validation that will get you a very long way if you want to work on, changing your relationship to your feelings. Because I feel like also someone with BPD, it's not the feelings that they have which is the problem. It's the way it's their relationship to their feelings that's the problem. It's not that they're sad or angry or happy. It's that when they get sad, angry, or happy, the next thought isn't let me feel that. It's, well, what does this mean about me? What does this mean about maintaining relationships with other people? How does this reflect my failings in life and my inadequacy? Like, all of those things interrupt what should be a very immediate experience of whatever's happening. And that kind of goes back to the attachment stuff, because if you were born into an attachment environment that was secure and you were allowed to experience yourself without having to accommodate others, well, all of a sudden this relationship to your feelings is very direct. But if you need to circumvent that to make sure that your caregiver is still attached to you because you're blaming yourself and making it your responsibility that they stay attached to you, all of a sudden you have these brakes that have been put onto your mind that get smashed every time you have a feeling.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Unless maybe, and so then this is the other thing. I think people with BPD who happen to be women tend to probably feel a lot more sadness, because I think women generally are just more comfortable feeling sad. And so that becomes the safety of coping when you're feeling weird. It's like, well, at least I feel safe feeling sad, so I'm going to feel sad. So people with BPD that are women tend to lean more towards sadness and depression and all that stuff. Whereas people with BPD who are men, because anger is probably one of the only emotions they don't have a weird relationship with, they quickly jump to anger whenever they're dysregulated. And so whichever direction you go, it's just you're deviating from just feeling how you feel.
Certainly. Like, I think the two things that can really work towards healing is a better understanding of your emotions and your relationship to them, and then also working towards receiving and allowing yourself to receive validation. Because a lot of people with BPD were in childhood environments where they cried, and for whatever reason, the crying didn't work and their needs weren't met. And so that wound stuck with them into adulthood. And so now they need to hopefully find a healthy space, hopefully a really good therapist that hears all of their pain. Their unhealthy cries for affection hopefully are met with even more healthy empathic responses, so it almost levels it out. So that's sort of the role of the therapist or the role of some empathic person, taking on the weight of your pain that was lost in childhood. But then the other piece becomes part of your own work, which is opening the door to that. But then also like resources like Wise Mind, like, oh wow, so you are very in touch with your emotions. You kind of have a gift when it comes to your instincts. The benefits of the emotions are that you have these instinctual abilities to relate to people. And then, oh wait, we're missing out on a lot of the reasonable mind here. Well, how do we allow yourself to structure your thoughts long enough while feeling the negative emotions, to sit with them long enough and to participate in spaces with people?
And that's where skills come in. Skills opens the door to your reasonable minds. That's I mean, I think when we always used to like do a show of hands, how many of you have, like, 10 or 12 people in the room identify more with emotion mind versus reasonable mind, and 90% of them identify more with emotion minds. And that's why the work is learning how to regulate yourself so you can tap into this resource that's in you. But and on top of that, I feel like the root cause, or rather, like, if you want to heal BPD, the root belief that you have to challenge, or the root fear that you have to address, is this little lingering, I can never get it off my back feeling that people just don't care enough about me. Because like you were saying, at the root of early childhood experience was your pain was going unrecognized, and really that person probably did not care enough about you, otherwise your emotional needs would be more attended to. So like you said, it's like the real way to heal BPD is, number one, recognize that your past experiences aren't going to go away, so healing it is not getting rid of it. But number two, you have to start challenging this idea that just because you weren't cared for enough in childhood, it doesn't mean you can't be cared for adequately in adulthood.
Yes. And one more important caveat, I think, is that a lot of people that seem to have BPD, and maybe even do, you might know better than me, were children with autism, because they've had countless experiences of being invalidated by probably proper parents that just didn't understand them. Why are you reacting so much to this loud noise? Why are you so sensitive to this style of clothing? Your sister was fine with this. You were such a difficult child, and maybe the parents are sort of justified in one way of like, well, they're assuming that their neurochemistry is the same, but realizing that with autism, you are experiencing so much dysregulation that's being so invalidated, not just by your parents, but by your environment and the people around you who don't understand you. And then you go on to seek so much validation. And most people with autism never find that validation. And then they become adults who more so either want to isolate or, they never really learn about noise canceling headphones. Who knows what, right? But it's just such a sad sort of experience, because and there's just one route, one pathway that can explain one connection between this personality disorder and this, neurodivergence.
Yeah, I do feel like that's a really interesting topic. And it's like all of these things, like, I guess just to wrap it up because we're really way over, but all of these things like CPTSD, autism, BPD, there's ADHD, all of them have like a lot of identity stuff in there. And the ways in which that identity stuff manifests in their attachment style, it can often feel like such a big hurdle. It can often feel like you really never will be able to attain a relationship that is secure, because you just don't trust people. Like at its core, it's an issue of trust. And for whatever reason, you were told early on in your life, like, don't accept this part about yourself because I'm not accepting this part about yourself, you know?
Yep, that's right on the heartbeat, I think.
Yeah.
Which is probably a good way to wrap up, but that's really good. Comment below what you guys want to learn about next or talk about next.
Cool. Okay, let's see if we got the house.